Hi everyone, thank you all for joining us today. As some of you have probably noticed, I'm not Leah Dahan. Leah unfortunately isn't able to chair today, so I've stepped in instead. My name is Amrit Swali. I'm a project coordinator in the International Security Programme here at Chatham House. I'm also the gender co-chair for Chatham House's EDI working group, and I'm really excited to be chairing the launch event today. Before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping rules. We're on the record today and the event will also be recorded. There will be a Q&A session in the latter half of the event, so if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, praises, anything, you'll have a chance to ask them. If you do want to ask a question, please use the raise hand function and I'll invite you to speak. If you don't wish to speak, you can pop a question or a comment in the chat box and I will ask on your behalf. Please also keep your microphones muted if you're not speaking. I'm not going to be doing a Jackie Weaver and kicking anyone out for being disruptive, but it does make for a bit of a nicer atmosphere. In that sense. I'm really delighted to be joined by Laura Dunkley, Marissa Conway and Marion Mesmer today. Laura is Research Partnerships and Inclusion Officer at Chatham House, where she has led the Institute's internal gender working group to implement a really comprehensive diversity and inclusion action plan. Marissa is the co-founder of the Centre for Feminist Foreign Policy and a PhD candidate at the University of Bristol. Marion is the co-director of the British American Security Information Council, where she directs the nuclear disarmament and risk reduction programs. She's also undertaking a PhD at King's College London. As I'm sure you're all aware, the Gender Think Tanks and International Affairs Toolkit has been over 2 years in the making and is the result of Laura, Marissa and Marion's tireless efforts. The toolkit has been designed to encourage a gender-sensitive approach across think tank activities, from research to convening to comms and publishing. And it contains some really comprehensive tips and guidance for think tankers at every level, some of which I'm definitely going to be using in chairing this event today, hopefully. Laura will begin by giving us an overview of the toolkit, after which Marissa and Marion will talk about convening and comms and publishing respectively. So with that, on that note, Laura, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Amrit, and thank you for stepping in at such a last minute. It's much appreciated, and I know it's a daunting task to do. So yeah, I'm obviously delighted to be able to present this to you all today, and thanks for joining. As Amrit kind of mentioned, it's really been a long time in the making. It started with a breakfast series in 2018. Where we invited a group of experts and practitioners working on gender equality from a wide range of sectors, as well as other colleagues from various think tanks based in London. The breakfast series generated the content for the toolkit that we're discussing today. And over the last few years, we've just really added to it based on our own experiences and the extra resources that we've kind of found. And we thought that the toolkit would be a tangible output from the breakfast series to provide the think tank community with, a practical resource that we thought at the time was really missing. And the toolkit, as you'll see as we go through it today, has 4 main sections. So number 1, kind of an overall organizational approach. Number 2, convening. 3, research and analysis, and 4, comms and publishing. And overall, it has 3 main aims. So number 1 is to raise awareness within think tanks about gender as a system of power, but with a particular emphasis on taking an intersectional approach. That's really important for us. And the related best practices that work towards eliminating inequalities. Number 2, is to provide a guide for think tanks on how to begin adapting processes to bring about lasting and sustainable change. And 3 is to promote existing initiatives, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We really want to leverage existing knowledge and expertise, and to collate relevant resources that have come out of the breakfast series, but also that we've collected over the last two or so years, and we've collated that in a dashboard, which I'm going to show you in a second, and it's obviously signposted throughout the toolkit. With the toolkit, we intend for it to be a whole organization. it is intended for the whole organization, and we see that it's applicable to all departments, to kind of ensure engagement regardless of your position, your experience, or your level of seniority. And while the immediate focus has been on international affairs think tanks, we hope that other think tanks and possibly other organizations or other sectors working outside the scope of this will also find the toolkit beneficial. And the method we advocate for in the toolkit is really a whole organization approach, meaning that we want the focus to be on changing the systems and structures, processes and policies that underpin the operations and working ways of the think tank. Everyone has a responsibility, but we see that without making structural changes, we believe that progress will be quite limited. And most importantly, as I already mentioned, the approach we use in the toolkit, the approach that we advocate for, is absolutely intersectional. We recognise the multiple ways, that women, men, and non-binary people can be subjected to discrimination. And we believe this approach allows a closer analysis of how gender interacts with and is also impacted by other systems of power and their relation to other characteristics, such as ethnicity, race, age, social class, religion, disability, and sexual orientation. And we also want to be upfront and, in the creation of the toolkit, we want to acknowledge some of our limitations and the constraints this places on, our final output, such as our experiences and knowledge as a group of white people who created the initiative and then wrote the toolkit is not necessarily reflective of everyone's experiences and lived reality. Furthermore, the breakfast series itself was constrained by the diversity of participants who were able to attend on the day, the location of it being only in London in person, and also the amount of time that we all had together to kind of generate this content. However, we have tried to mitigate the impact of this through a really rigorous informal and formal peer review. Plus, it's our ambition that the toolkit really serves as a starting point. It's by no means, the most definitive guide, and that we really want it to be an iterative and collaborative process going forward. And we always remain open to feedback, and we hope that we can continue building on this and everything else that's ongoing within the think tank community together, going forward and well into the future. So before I quickly wrap up here, as I said, I'm just going to share my screen briefly so I can share the dashboard with you just to show you what I mean by that. So this is the dashboard, and it's just a collection of resources that we've found and used over the last couple of years that we received or were given by the breakfast participants, that we've kind of relied on. So again, this is, hopefully to be a collaboration and that we would like you to also feed into. So if there's any feedback that you have or any resources that you can see are missing, please do send them our way, and then we'll definitely update this. It's broken down into the sections that you will find in the toolkit as well as some other resources around like networks and groups and other things. So it'd be great to keep expanding on this and building it as we go along, so we have that one place where we can find all these fantastic resources that everyone has been working on and are really beneficial for everyone. I'm going to stop sharing now, and that's everything from me for the intro, and I'm going to hand over at this point to Marissa.
Hello. Okay, let me get my screen organized. Thank you so much, Laura. It's really cool to be here talking about this toolkit. As Laura said, it's been in the works for 3 years and is such a labor of love. So it's really exciting that this finally gets to see the light of day. I'm going to cover the section on convening and debate, which focuses on events and how we can foster events that promote equality both in the content and in the processes of event planning. I'll chat for just a quick 5 minutes, keep it nice and sweet and short so that we can save time for questions at the end, because I'm very excited to hear from all of you and any questions you have. So as Laura mentioned, this is, by no means meant to be the end all be all in terms of suggestions for how to better implement equality within an organization. But we wanted to, in this section, list a very practical kind of tick box type of format to walk people through really what this can look like to implement some of these ideas. So they're very tangible, very specific to help guide event organizers to promoting equality a little more efficiently. So we have framed events as a public and visible way to demonstrate an organization's commitment to equality. And the purpose of this section is really to acknowledge that without a diversity of voices on a wide range of topics, events can only capture a limited amount of information and knowledge and experience, and therefore the information that gets imparted to the audience is skewed in a particular direction. So we see it as very important that events are inclusive in this sense and really make an effort to be accessible and to bring in a bunch of different perspectives and knowledge, types of knowledge. So as Laura mentioned, the second goal of this toolkit is to guide think tanks in bringing about lasting and sustainable change. So this section is very oriented as this very specific guide. There are 5 areas of focus that help, that are oriented towards helping embed effective and lasting processes to foster diversity of thought, experience, and background in professional gatherings. So this can range anywhere from a invite-only small roundtable discussion to a big public event. The first of these 5 areas of focus is event structure. So this is framed around a set of questions to help event planners consider different aspects of their event. So the first is accessibility. And we pose the question, is this event accessible to all? And have a series of recommendations that you can use kind of as a list to check off to make sure these things are implemented in event planning. The second question is, are the arrangements practical for all? So this focuses on the room setup, the timing, the location, these sorts of things. And the third question is, are there costs that make the event restrictive? So this is focusing on compensation in particular, and making sure that speakers are compensated for their time, because not all experts are salaried, for example, and making sure that cost isn't a prohibitive factor in having a wide attendance, essentially. The next question, the fourth, has to do with speakers. So do the speakers, chairs, or panelists feel supported? And this is what it sounds like, a way to make sure that the speakers themselves have everything they need to do a wonderful job speaking at the event. And we also have Q&A, which we will test out, I suppose, at this event right now. So our Q&A sessions designed to mitigate structural and unconscious biases. So for example, studies show that when a woman is the first person called on during a Q&A, more women are then likely to join the discussion versus if a man is picked first during the Q&A session. So we've tried to draw out kind of these interesting pieces of information that can help even the playing field a little bit. The next section in this toolkit is representation and other dynamics. So we believe it's very important to include speakers from different backgrounds, from different genders, ethnicities, race, age, social class, religion, disability, and sexual orientation. This is a huge priority, as we say in this toolkit, and it's also important to avoid tokenism when considering representation. So for those who might be unfamiliar with the term, tokenism is the practice of including a small number of marginalized people purely for the sake of looking inclusive. So we are encouraging representation without tokenism, and there's a bit more information about that in the toolkit. we also, I feel like I'm speeding through this, have a section on code of conduct, which is a suggestion that organizations should draft and adopt a code of conduct for events so they can clearly define what is expected of all event participants. So this is essentially a document that sets out expectations for everyone involved, delegates, attendees, speakers, volunteers, etc., to ensure that everyone is on the same page about what is expected at this event, and also to kind of set some rules defining acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And second to last, we have monitoring and evaluation. And we have suggested two main ways of doing this as a means to consistently build in feedback mechanisms to ensure that this toolkit is something that can be implemented regularly and not just as a one-off. So the first way is a simple feedback mechanism after every event. So forms to fill out, a survey emailed after, these types of things. And the second suggestion is an ongoing internal monitoring of all events. So again, this consistent monitoring is a way to make sure that the information in this toolkit is something that can get used time and time again, and these processes can be refined rather than just stuck on and forgotten about. The last section is training, which is looking at staff training on the issues in this toolkit as a whole to make sure that there is organizational buy-in. And this isn't, this section is just focused on events, that, for example, this wouldn't just be used for event planners, but these principles are understood by everyone across the organization as priorities for all. So I have sped through that. I have to say, it's so strange to have everyone on mute and not have like that feedback when I'm talking. I also have a bonus for listening to me speak, which is my kitten I got over the weekend. She says hello. And now I will turn it over to Marion.
Thanks so much, Marissa. A kitten is a really hard act to follow, but I'll do my very best. Writing this toolkit was a really great team effort between me, Marissa, and Laura, and with support from the whole Chatham House team. And I'd also like to say a big thanks to my colleague Sebastian Brixey-Williams here at Basic, who originally helped kick off the whole breakfast series and helped us pioneer this work. So I'll be covering the sections on communication and publishing, and then summing up some of the work that we've done here, and then we can go into the Q&A. And I'm really looking forward to hearing all of your feedback and hearing your brilliant questions. So communications and publishing play a key role in the work that we all do. Many of us use reports and social media as the main vehicle to communicate our research findings and project outcomes with the outside world. And it therefore makes sense to begin planning for inclusive communication at the start of the project. Something that came out really clearly in the breakfast series and that we tried to capture in the toolkit is that it's really hard to retrofit inclusion at the end of the project cycle. That's why we've tried to stress throughout that, starting at the beginning and trying to incorporate some of these practices will make it a lot easier to make sure that your project outcomes are also going to be inclusive at the end. I'll be going through a few different aspects of inclusive publishing and inclusive communication. The first one is considering what images will be used. And I think here it shows really clearly how it really helps if the project was designed to be inclusive from the start, because that might then open up the opportunity to take pictures of participants, if that's something that's possible, as you go along, and then those can be used in the final report. If that's not possible for some reason, how can you ensure that the pictures used are sensitive to the stakeholders who were involved? And this is particularly important for projects that engage marginalized communities. Another really important question to ask is who the target audience for the project outcomes is. And something we thought was particularly important to consider here is that the target audience is really homogeneous. And if different target groups are meant to be reached, it might make sense to think about which channels are best to reach those target groups and to vary outputs across those channels. So that means rather than just focusing on the traditional report, it might also make sense to have shorter summaries, different types of outputs for social media versus traditional media, and just playing around a bit with channels of communication. And if a particular group of stakeholders were used in the project, it's also really important to think about how they can be engaged when it comes to the dissemination of the project findings. If peer review is something that your organization uses, then ensuring that the process is double blind, which means that the authors don't know who reviews them and the peer reviewers don't know who the authors are, is an easy way to ensure that that process is as unbiased as possible, as well as ensuring that the pool of peer reviewers is reflecting the diversity of researchers in the field, and that peer reviewers know what to look out for, especially when it comes to things around gender-related questions, for example. Something that Marissa already stressed and Laura stressed as well is that when your organization is thinking about how some of these changes could be made, it's really important to make sure that this brings everyone along in the organization. I think an important group to keep in mind here is, in particular, any communications teams that you might have. So thinking about how you can embed these colleagues from the start of the project design process can help make sure that you're planning for your project plan and your dissemination plan as you're thinking about designing the project. And they might be able to ask questions about communication processes in team meetings that researchers might not think of, for example. Around all of this, it's also really important to have clear processes and written guidance available so that any new staff members or even staff members who just want to refresh their memory know where to find that information. That way, knowledge can be shared effectively across the organization, and you avoid having the issue that only one or two people are kind of the bottleneck around knowledge dissemination. Something that was also a big topic at one of our breakfast series was online harassment, which is a big issue, particularly for women. And having organizational procedures in place so that all your staff members know what resources are available to them should they become subjected to online harassment can be really helpful, because it helps staff members know that they're not on their own and that the organization is ready and prepared to support them. When it comes to working with external partners like the media, again, this is an area where clear organizational guidelines are really helpful. And communications teams can also play a really important role here in providing in-house media training, maintaining contact with journalists, and ensuring that all team members consider sharing their expertise externally, rather than just leaving it up to the researchers who are particularly keen to get in touch with the media to do so. And then lastly, partnerships, whether they're with funders or whether with other organizations, can be a really powerful way to share some of the learning that your organization might have as you move through this process. And yeah, we would just encourage you to think about how you can share the knowledge that and your experiences that you've had with other organizations, and how you can exchange about best practice and share learning in that way. Something that also really helps here is regular and systematic data collection, because that will allow you both to have a really strong data set where you can show ways in which your organization has changed and perhaps improved, but it also helps you identify where you might still have a longer way to go. And it also helps you to identify where in particular you want to perhaps focus on next. So that's something we'd really encourage. So to conclude, we've summarized all of our recommendations into 5 top tips, and Amrit is going to share that page of the report so that you can all see it, because that's one very neat little page. Thanks for that. So our first tip is, again, to summarize, to involve the whole organization in any changes you want to make. Everyone needs to be brought along, and including different opportunities for feedback ensures that nothing is missed as you go through the auditing process to figure out where you need to make changes in your organization. Secondly, we wanted to highlight that gender equality is really everyone's responsibility, and not just that of those who are affected the most. Thirdly, as the speakers before me have already pointed out, it's really important to be intersectional. Gender does not exist in a vacuum, and other aspects of people's lived experiences are equally important to how they understand the world. Fourth, be consistent and persistent. It's hard or impossible to achieve change overnight, but continuing to check in and making progress will really help you continue to move forward, even if it seems really hard at first. And finally, collect data and share best practices. That really helps to make sure that this change in your organization is sustained and sustainable, but it also really helps the wider organizational ecosystem, because other organizations can benefit from anything that you might have learned, and you know, you can perhaps learn from what other organizations have done before you. So at this point, I'll stop and I'll hand it back to Amrit. Thanks so much.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, yeah, Laura's just going to jump in quickly.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and backpedal slightly and briefly, 2 or 3 minutes, talk about research and analysis, which is the third section of the toolkit. I won't spend a long time going over it. It's quite a detailed, heavy section, but I just wanted to maybe outline or highlight the approach that we've taken within that. And it's also an approach that I've kind of been pilot testing along with some of the research teams at Chatham House over the last couple of years. And I think within research and analysis, I think it's for a think tank that doesn't have significant gender programming or in-house gender and inclusion expertise, conducting gender-sensitive research analysis and analysis can be quite challenging. And I think it requires expertise and technical knowledge, and I found that there can be quite a gap between understanding concepts and the practical application of an intersectional gender-sensitive approach, basically, particularly when you're working on gender and looking at social inclusion more broadly. And in addition, it might only be considered if either the funder requests it or it's added as a bit of an afterthought, which obviously runs the risk of it becoming tokenistic and quite ineffective, or it's not something that's considered throughout the entire project. So the toolkit tries to explain why it's important to be thinking about this, but it also provides a guide for researchers throughout the entire life cycle of a project. So from the very beginning stages of idea conception to proposal writing through to the actual research and analysis itself, and then the final dissemination stages, be it report launches or events and any other kind of method that's used. And we outline a two-pronged approach, basically, which covers, in the first instance, is research processes and project management, which covers who is involved in the project and how the research will be conducted. And then the second kind of aspect or approach is looking at the project content and the technical focus, which covers what the project will focus on through an intersectional gender analysis. And then the toolkit, so basically it takes that two-pronged approach and provides a checklist with much more detail, also covering aspects such as M&E and training and things like that. So yeah, I just wanted to quickly jump in there and give a brief overview of that. And obviously we can take more detailed questions in the Q&A. So yeah, sorry for interrupting the flow. I'll hand back to Amrit now.
No worries, thank you all very much. Before I come to all of you for questions and comments, and please do share questions and comments, otherwise we'll all be listening to me trying to formulate questions for the next 45 minutes, which I don't think anyone wants. I have a few follow-ups of my own. Firstly, I wonder if Laura, Marissa and Marion, if you could perhaps give us some examples of how the methods outlined in the toolkit are being implemented in your own organisations and how well they're working. So Marissa, perhaps if we start with you.
So in terms of implementation, I might be the least helpful to hear from, because we are a feminist organization and we're quite small. So I think there are a lot of things that are just defaulted towards this work. And I know we've spoken with some people whose organizations are defaulted away from feminist work. So there's definitely a difference in applicability that I want to acknowledge first and foremost. I will say, having spoken about the event section, just to refer back to that, we have from the beginning, CFFP has been around for 4 years in the UK now, tried to make an effort to implement a lot of these principles, but even just going through in this kind of like methodological way, I suppose, of detailing out what it really looks like to make sure that our events are promoting equality has been really helpful for me. And the payment for speakers in particular has been kind of a big aha moment for us, and really thinking about how that is a huge barrier to participation for experts who aren't salaried. And as a small organization, we have a small budget, and at the beginning never paid our speakers. You know, there's definitely a lot of volunteer speaking that happens in the foreign policy space, which can work for some, but we realized that was a massive barrier, particularly with feminist activists who tend not to have that kind of stable salaried work. So decided to make it a policy for our events in the UK to pay all our speakers, even if it's a small honorarium, just to make sure that we're including that in our budgets for all of the events that we do. So I think that's one example of something that I have learned from this toolkit in particular. And there's a section on supporting with childcare as well, to make sure that speakers don't have an issue in attending. And that's also something that we have taken into practice as well, to make sure that we also cover, well, obviously at the moment, everything's online, but back when we were doing in-person events, making sure that we offered compensation for childcare fees as well, to make sure that that wasn't a barrier to having speakers join us.
Brilliant, thank you, Marissa. Marion, could we perhaps come to you for some examples of how the toolkit has been implemented in your organization?
Yeah, of course. So at BASIC, over the past year or so, we've been involved in a range of different activities that try to further similar aims to the toolkit. So we've been trying to be really broad about how we audit the different aspects of our organization and what kind of things we implement. So you know, we're active participants in WCAP's brilliant initiative, Organizations in Solidarity, as well as this year's N-Square Fellowship, which is all about culture in the nuclear policy sector and how organizations can improve that. And as part of our work across all of these initiatives, we've audited and updated our HR policies. And one of the things we were really passionate about was ensuring that all of our internships are paid, because that's also a big, access issue that we didn't particularly focus on in this toolkit, but that generally precludes people from a diverse range of backgrounds to actually participate in policy work and to kind of enter the field. Specifically when it comes to this toolkit, now that we've got the finalized version, I'll be taking that back to BASIC as well, and encouraging the whole team to think about how we can implement some of the different ideas in there. And I think, especially when it comes to monitoring and evaluation, we've been thinking about how we can collect data to kind of show the work that we do better, and also to capture some of the areas in which we need to do better. So that's something that I'll be thinking about more going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And Laura, how is Chatham House faring on implementing this toolkit?
Yes, so we've been doing quite a bit of work across some of our main activities that reflective of the toolkit. So along the lines of events, comms, and research. A couple of years ago, we set up a gender working group that implemented a gender action plan that had various activities across the 3 sections that I just mentioned, and within that there was various objectives across data collection, making sure we're monitoring representation across all our events and our comms, and publishing, various things around making sure that events are inclusive, from the design of an event to the event itself and the follow-up. So all the things that we're outlining or advocating for in the toolkit. Obviously not perfectly, with there's various hurdles to that, and there's various things that we're still working on. I think data collection has been definitely a challenge, but I think we've got to the point where we're consistently doing it around the events and the research programs events and through our comms and stuff. So that's been really great progress. As well, picking up on what Marissa said, thinking about childcare aspects in our budgets, where possible, in events as well, and within our research. We've tried that a few times. And then within our research as well, we have a few projects now that have a significant gender lens, which is really fantastic, particularly on the cyber portfolio. They're still ongoing projects, so there's no tangible results that I can kind of share with you right now, but that will be really exciting in 1 or 2 years when they kind of come to an end, and then we can share our experiences. And I'm pretty sure that the results of the project will also be will be really improved and bolstered by having this extra gender and inclusion focus. And we hired for some of the projects an additional consultant to work alongside the teams to bolster the expertise along there. So that's been a really fantastic thing to see kind of grow, and the teams gaining in their expertise and confidence in being able to build that into projects. As I said, talking about the research and analysis section can be quite difficult and challenging section or area to work on. So it's been really great to see that. And then so that the 2-year action plan finished in the summer of 2020, and based on the feedback we've had from Chatham House staff and the needs and the objectives that we're able to achieve and what we weren't able to do in that time, we realized that obviously the focus on gender is way too narrow. It misses a lot. It misses a lot of people in their experiences and how they're feeling. So we've now moved to a much broader focus. So equality, diversity, and inclusion, which includes a focus on not just gender, but race, socioeconomic backgrounds, the LGBTQAE+ community, and disability as well. So obviously Leah's chairing that. She wasn't able to join us today, and Amrit's the gender chair of that group. So they'll be doing really fantastic things to try and expand on what we've done over the last 2 years, but make it much more inclusive, and really listening to staff. I think that's really crucial, listening what people feel and what they think is necessary to kind of make the changes at Chatham House. And obviously we'll be taking the toolkit away as well, and also reflecting internally, as Marion said, about how we can implement it better and what we can do along there. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. I have a couple more questions, and then I'll go to Sophia and Emily, because they've both got their hands raised, which is great. You say in the toolkit at the start that this project kind of came about as a response to what you describe as the gendered nature of think tanks. I wondered if you could perhaps tell us a bit more about how you all saw that manifesting itself within the industry, and the kind of challenges and norms you were up against, and how you went about trying to mitigate those. Marion, I wonder if we could start with you.
Sure. I wasn't a part at the very beginning of the breakfast series, so I can just give you my reflection on that kind of quote now. I think there's a lot that goes on about how we think about expertise and how we structure expertise in society, that excludes a lot of people. There are some really interesting studies where people are asked how they imagine an expert, or where you try to assess people's people's reactions to certain people when they speak, or how seriously they take certain speakers. And all of that has been reflected in the think tank community for a long time, where you see a real difference in between who is research and project staff and who's supporting staff. You see a real difference in who's at the leadership of certain organizations. And given that think tanks have a lot of impact on policy formulation and so on, we thought that it was really important to ensure that think tanks are as diverse as the rest of the population, and kind of reflect broader demographic patterns and changes, to make sure that the research that's being done and the policy recommendations that are made can actually speak to everyone and include everyone, and yeah, to avoid the pitfall that policy is made for some but not for everyone. So that's how I would react to that statement. I'm sure others have more to say on that topic, but yeah, I think it's just that as a society we tend to prioritize certain voices over others, and that was at the heart of this project and what we want to challenge. And I think over the past few years we've seen big changes being made there, which is really fantastic, but we can do more there as well. Thank you.
And Laura or Marissa, do either of you have anything to add to that? I'm going to take that as, oh, Marissa's just done.
Just to say what Marion said was brilliant, and knowledge production in general when it comes to IR tends to be quite elitist and hierarchical, as Marion mentioned. So we found this work to be very, very pressing and very important.
But also, if I can add to that, the different ways in which, say, knowledge production then is handled within the think tank as well, particularly a large organization. It might not be the same for every institute, but if you've got one section, one area that's really clued up in, is really driving forward the agendered approach, but that isn't necessarily reflected or picked up elsewhere within the think tank. So, that's why we try to take an organizational approach. So all areas of the think tank are kind of synced up and are, understand the concepts, and are not able to then let at the last minute let something down when the report comes out and it's not, the gendered implications of the research aren't pulled through properly. So yeah, we just wanted to highlight this, that it's it's very much effective across the entire organization, and should be considered within all roles, within all areas of the think tank. So yeah.
Great, thank you. And just following up from that, obviously in the toolkit you advocate for viewing think tanks as a holistic organization that has very interlinked departments. So I was just wondering, given like the differences in procedures, functions, and outputs that of, for example, say a research department and a commercial department, how do you make the case for a holistic approach that makes sure that all of these initiatives are kind of linked together and working towards one goal? How do you see that working? Laura, should we start with you actually on that?
Yeah, kind of follows what I was saying. So again, it might depend on from institution to institution, and I think it's important to reflect the different contexts within which everyone works. But I think agreeing kind of like a strategy and implementing training, and making sure bringing everyone up to speed on the concepts and not making sure that things aren't taken for granted, that everyone understands or has the knowledge or capacity, I think is really important as well. So I think that goes some way to kind of creating a bit of an organizational approach. I don't think there's ever any one thing. I think it's a combination of things. Also, obviously, making sure that management are on board, and it's as much as a top-down approach as it is bottom-up.
Marissa and Marion, do either of you want to jump in on that?
Just to say that from like a feminist theory perspective, a lot of that work is focused on highlighting the interconnectedness of everything we do. So on a larger scale, looking across the field of IR or foreign policy or whatever, it's seeing how the local impacts the global and vice versa. And so even within an organization, I think kind of rooting this approach with a gendered lens, which I know, speaking for the three of us with backgrounds in feminist theory, kind of recognizing how everything influences everything else, and we can't do something in isolation and expect it to work. And at the same time, like, creating systemic institutional change is a slow process and needs buy-in as a whole. And while having certain voices or certain people who can champion this, at the end of the day, it really does take this collective effort to take the first few steps forward. Yeah, that was my. And obviously, like, Laura is the one to go to when it comes to the logistics of what this looks like. But I think in terms of the philosophy behind why this is a good idea, I definitely encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to like dive into some good feminist theory literature, because it just really excellently paints the picture of why this is a good idea and very helpful.
Yeah, and I would just finally add to both of those, or the many excellent points already made by Laura and Marissa, that institutional change is only sustainable if it's actually embedded within the institution rather than held among the people who are a part of the institution at any given point. And so that was our other motivation for highlighting that this ought to be a comprehensive approach and an approach that takes the entire organization with it. Because if these practices aren't embedded in staff manuals, in policy processes and so on, then they're going to be lost as staff transition out of their roles and into other organizations. And that means that all the hard work that was invested to getting to that point in the first place might be lost. Whereas if it actually becomes a process of institutional transformation, where some of these learnings and changes are embedded in policy documents and processes, then that means that it can become a part of how the institution operates, and that makes it a lot more sustainable.
Great, thank you. Can we now go to Sophia Close? I think you've had your hand up. You can unmute.
Sure, thank you for taking a question. Congratulations on finally getting this out. I recall going to the workshops and all the constructive discussions, and it's fantastic to see a product out of this. My question relates to, I guess, in a way, this is an incredibly practical resource, and what I see it doing is sort of jump starting a lot of the or overcoming some of the early resistance that happens when you're looking to integrate gender into your organisation, and the sort of really practical steps that you've provided help sort of provide guidance to that process. What's not explicitly discussed, and I'm wondering if that there's another avenue for that, or you've been thinking about this within your own organisations, is the role of organisational leadership and the power holders that sort of push back and create resistance for gender to be truly holistically integrated into the organisations in the way that you're talking about, and that I'm sure we're all dedicated to supporting in our own roles. And it's I'm doing a separate project with peace building organisations specifically looking at this, and we're really, really focused on shifting those internal power dynamics and acknowledging the very personal nature of this change, and personal and political nature of the change to integrate gender. So I'm just wondering if you could sort of reflect on that, and perhaps if any of the resources that you touched on with it, do they flag about how to engage at that level?
Laura, I think we might want to start with you, given I know you've been very much involved with pushing the gender agenda at Chatham House. So perhaps if you want to start, and then we can go to Marion and Marissa.
Yeah, thank you, Sophia. It's a great question, and it's something that, yes, we've very much been grappling with, still are grappling with, and don't necessarily have that one answer. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't think I can recommend any one resource that kind of encapsulates that. But basically, what we've been doing at Chatham House is, just constantly like chipping away at getting the management involved at all levels, and kind of really discussing the concepts and discussing why it's important and what differences it makes to try and shift the conversation. I don't think we've really discussed the concept of power, and I don't think that's a concept that is widely discussed within think tanks as like that's the root of the problem and that's the bit that we need to target. So that's really interesting. But it's something that we obviously really want to going forward and what we want to take from this discussion. And you're right, very rightly so, it's very much a Kickstarter for conversations. And we want to then take this and then pinpoint certain areas that we think, okay, we really need to focus that on. And I think in terms of like not including any, big sections on this is that we didn't have the space in that it would become a huge 100, 200 page document that then no one would look at, and then it just doesn't serve a purpose anymore. So that's something that we're definitely looking to work on. And yeah, absolutely open to hearing everyone else's experiences with this, by the tackling the concept of power and the way it manifests in different ways, and also like bringing leadership and how that looks in different organizations and different contexts. I don't know if Marion and Marissa want to add to this.
Yeah, well, one thing I'll add is that if this is something that is difficult within your organization or that where you foresee difficulty, I think it also helps that each element of this toolkit can be broken down into individual steps. So we're not saying that the whole package has to be implemented straight away in one fell swoop, but you can pick an area where you think it might be easiest for your organization or where it makes most sense for your organization to start, and then to build it from there. I mean, Laura already mentioned that, chipping away at some of the entrenched views or some of the sort of biases people might have against a gender-sensitive approach is one way of approaching this. And I think also, as the wider culture changes and it becomes more acceptable to have these kind of conversations, and they permeate into different kind of fora, the easier it might become to engage a more reticent management in these conversations, because it won't hopefully just be internal pressure that draws them in, but they will also have heard some of these terms, some of these discussions externally, perhaps from peers. And I think, we're now in the lucky position that this has become such a widely spread discussion that is hopefully easier for leadership to see the logic behind wanting to make changes, because it's become a sort of cultural conversation as a whole.
Brilliant, thank you. Emily Enright, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks so much. This has been brilliant, and the report, I've had a bit of a look through, and it's really quite groundbreaking. So it's just inspiring to see in the community. Marion did touch on kind of the premise of my question, but I'd love to revisit it in a broader sense. What struck me about the report, obviously it's really focused on think tank activities and program activities particularly. To my mind, and Marion's heard me rant about this before, a somewhat neglected part of this conversation, the conversation around diversity and inclusion, particularly in think tanks, is workforce planning and recruitment and career development, and the way that the community is built that works on these defence and security issues. This, as you mentioned, Laura, there are lots of parts of this debate that were well beyond the scope of this particular report. A 1,000-page binder probably wouldn't cover everything that needs to be covered, but I wonder whether this kind of area, these HR-related areas, particularly around recruitment, workforce planning in a broader kind of sense, and career development for individuals working in think tanks, is something that you as a team thought about. Is it an area that was raised as part of the deliberations that went into this report? And if not, have you come across any good resources on best practices in this space that you hope think tanks will come across and pick up and really run with?
Thank you. Marion, do you want to kick us off with that, and then we can go to Laura and Marissa?
Sure, I can make a start on that. Thanks so much for that question, Emily. So this is something that I think is definitely really important. It wasn't necessarily in the scope of the original breakfast series, which is what structured the toolkit in the end. But you're absolutely right that one could hold a whole different event series and produce yet another toolkit just focused on HR practices. In order to sort of point people towards a tangible resource, as part of our work with N-Square that I mentioned earlier, that includes working on HR practices and thinking about how HR and working culture interact when it comes to, in the instance of that initiative, particularly the nuclear policy community. So there will hopefully be some more tangible things coming out there. But I also know that colleagues at other organizations like Brussels Binders, for example, have published other toolkits that focus on other elements of thinking through inclusion in organizations. Generally, I would say that investing in our workforce is one of the most impactful ways how institutions can ensure team well-being, and also ensuring that that those who might not necessarily have access to the same resources can have the same opportunities as their colleagues. So it's definitely something that I would encourage all organizations to also think about as they're deliberating some of the many ideas that we put to them in our toolkit.
Great.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Yeah, thanks, Emily. No, it's a huge area that we didn't focus on during the breakfast series. In and of itself, we didn't have substantial HR expertise in the room, so we didn't then want to write about it and get it horribly wrong in the toolkit. But we will be hosting, so Chatham House with some other European think tanks will be hosting another workshop like this in a couple of weeks to focus exactly on that, exactly on those questions, because it's a huge area that we it goes part and parcel with all the other things that we're discussing in terms of like taking an organizational approach to drive change, to make it more diverse and inclusive. You have to think about recruitment and your staff and who you're bringing in, as well as making sure that when they're there, the environment is welcoming and is inclusive and remains so in a sustainable way. And it's not, as we've already mentioned, it just doesn't just disappear because one person leaves their job. So yes, it's something that and it came up we did discuss it in the workshops as well, absolutely. But yes, it could be in another toolkit in and of itself. So yeah, I hope it's not really, well, I hope that answers your question. Doesn't go into detail, but yeah. And we would also be really keen to hear, obviously, other people's thoughts on this, adding to anything that we've added.
Brilliant, thank you. I just wondered if we could quickly go to my colleague Beza, who's popped a comment in the chat about blind peer reviews. Beza, if you want to come in quickly.
Sure, Emrit. So I guess on the blind peer reviews, I think I just put the comment, but I have a question actually for the team. I'm wondering about how can we think about this toolkit as a way to think about diversity in general, and do you see areas that are similar if we want to ever create a diversity toolkit, and what those would be? Or do you see challenges if we actually bring diversity into the discussion? Then would we be giving away more from the gender side, or how can we create that balance?
Great, thank you, Beza. Marissa, can I come to you first for an answer for that?
Yeah, I think in terms of like more work around these issues, we are very keen to explore what comes next. This is a conversation we've had with the three of us. I think having more information on how to better achieve equality as an organization can only help, not harm. So I think diversity is definitely kind of like its own theme. And, there's a lot of criticism around diversity and inclusion initiatives as being too surface level and not going into systemic change. But there are also really interesting initiatives doing important work and making a difference. So we haven't gone too far down this path enough to really be able to like comment more on this. Maybe Laura or Marion can jump in. But I think whatever tools work best, especially when dealing with people or institutions who might be hesitant to implementing some of these changes, I think the more the merrier personally. And these themes are some of the things that the three of us and more will be discussing kind of as like next steps. What is the follow-up to this toolkit?
Yeah, what I would add to that is I think what's really important is to recognize that, if you want to increase diversity in a broader sense, it's important not to draw the same lessons from gender and apply it to any other marginalized group, because what's really important is to recognize what can make life difficult in a work environment, in a research environment for people from other marginalized groups, and then have targeted interventions to try and remove those barriers. And because the breakfast series was predominantly framed around questions of gender inequality and how to remove barriers specifically for women, we didn't then want to sort of have to go through a similar process for all other aspects of diversity and kind of artificially create things that actually weren't discussed, and run into the possibility of making an error here of doing exactly what I just said one shouldn't do, of equating gender and other forms of diversity. I think you're absolutely right, Beza, that ideally this is something we could have tackled from the start. And there is a lot more work there to be done. There are a lot of other organizations who try to make sure that think tanks become more welcoming for people of color and for people from other marginalized groups. And I think that's really important. And we'll be watching those initiatives really closely to see where we can support and where there are synergies that we can draw on.
And just to quickly cap off the thoughts here, I think the other thing that organisations should really think about doing is like really listening to staff and what their experiences are of working within the organisation, what they're asking to change. I think that's really important as like a first step in seeing what's working and what's not working, and then not trying to take a blanket approach, thinking about gender and then just applying it, across the board. That's definitely not going to work. Just really listening and taking care to hear what people are saying, I think is really important for what organisations do.
Brilliant, thank you, Laura. Emma Rainey, can I turn to you for a question?
Yes, thank you. So congratulations on the toolkit. It was really exciting seeing it this morning, and it's really excellent with some of the tips that you've shared as like a starting point. I was just wondering, and sorry if this is somewhat repetitive to some of the questions that's already been asked. Have you got plans to do more? Like, I know that you've just finished this after like 2 years, but it'd be interesting to hear if there's any more ideas in the pipeline.
Laura, do you want to start with that? I can see you moving closer to your camera.
Well, it was just more in response to saying first, I think I need a break, having worked on this solidly, trying to get it over the line for the last year. So no, I think there are definitely plans. We're already thinking about what we can do next. We obviously want to hear from other organisations and how we can partner to work on areas that maybe we haven't covered, or expand on things that that need more expansion on, or people see the merit in doing so from the toolkit. We would like to connect more of our networks over the coming weeks with this toolkit, also obviously internally reflecting on what we've written and how that applies to us as institutions. Reaching out on social media and that kind of thing. And then I think Marion and Marissa can speak further to this, but also looking for funding sources to really continue this work and see where we can take it next. That would be really fantastic. And we at Chatham House also now have much bigger capacity, and I'm pleased to say a paid capacity focusing on equality, diversity within this organisation. So I'm really hopeful that they will be able to drive something forward. That would be fantastic. And I should announce that I'm actually leaving Chatham House at the end of April. So my journey with Chatham House will end there. But as I said, the EDI team in place will be absolutely fantastic in carrying this forward. And I hand over to Marissa and Marion, who I'm sure have something to add on this.
I'm personally really interested in implementing a lot of the things in this toolkit and figuring out how, once again, we can get funding to kind of take this to the next step and work perhaps more directly with think tanks in really integrating these ideas and principles into their work. Obviously, it's very much in conversation mode, and I don't think any of us are going to move forward until we have secured funding to do this work. So it may be a little bit of a slow process, but I am very enthusiastic about this and definitely want to continue to do this type of thing.
Yeah, I really agree with Marissa here. That's something we'd also be really interested in. And alongside that, we'll continue with all of the other work streams that we've picked up in this realm. So back in December, we launched our Emerging Voices Network, which is focused on increasing diversity among young emerging experts on nuclear policy. This is a global network that also brings in expertise from countries that sometimes have a hard time making their voice heard on nuclear issues. And we also really focused on gender diversity among the network participants. We'll also continue to amplify and participate in partner organizations' work on this. The WCAP's Organizations in Solidarity initiative that I mentioned earlier is still ongoing, and we'll continue to participate in that. And we have other ongoing work with other partner organizations there, where we can hopefully share more later on in the year.
Brilliant, thank you. Anna Maria, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. I think my question actually speaks a little bit about what everyone's mentioned just now about funding, because obviously, like think tanks, research, policy space, nothing works without getting money for it. And I just wondered if any of you could talk about any experiences you had of, talking to external partners and funders about why this stuff is important, whether it's something more low level, like just securing funding to be able to pay speakers or pay double bind peer reviews, or to have gender mainstreaming in some of the bigger research projects and outputs. I just wondered if any of you could talk about that, because obviously we've talked about a lot of stuff internally, management change and attitudes and ethos and listening to what staff want. You also potentially feel that can be another lever point, right? If donors and external partners are interested in this, if they're willing to give funding, then that brings some of that pressure. So yeah, I just wondered if any of you had any experience or thoughts on that aspect of doing this work.
Marissa, I wonder if we might come to you first, given the feminist aspect is so ingrained in the work you do already.
Yeah, one of the areas we focus on is nuclear policy, and really exploring nuclear policy through a feminist lens, coming up with feminist policy recommendations. And we have been just very well received by the nuclear policy community. I'm American, if you couldn't hear the accent, so I'm well plugged into that group as well, because they have embraced us with open arms, and it's been wonderful, and that includes the funders. So I think within a couple issue areas in particular, it seems that people are really, really clocked on to why this is important to be incorporating a gender lens and feminist principles into this kind of work, and how it does result in really interesting and really different and unique recommendations and avenues for change to some of these like very long-standing issues. So I can say I feel very optimistic about this personally in terms of the work that we do. And we Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, we have a focus on feminist foreign policy as a framework to implement a lot of these changes. I think funders are still wrapping their head around feminist foreign policy as a concept, but kind of going by issue area and approaching funding streams that way and doing projects through a feminist lens so far has been the route that we have taken to get funding for our work, and has been working really well, knock on wood.
Thank you. Marissa, just to follow up to that, do you think that this kind of funder approach that you get is it based on just a lack of knowledge of what a gender analysis or what a feminist analysis can do in project making, project forming, and project management, or is it more of a reluctance to just kind of shift away from a more traditional means of funding?
So I want to preface this by saying, because we've got the word feminist in our name, I think there's an automatic filtering that happens before we even speak to anyone, because no one's going to approach us or take a meeting with us if they're not even like at least a little bit on board with feminist ideas. So that said, I think the biggest barrier really is just a lack of information. And even just last week, I was having a conversation with a foundation that I had approached to see if we would fit with their funding streams. And they just didn't really understand what this work actually looked like. And I saw our work as like spot on with the things they wanted to fund, but they were like, I don't see how this relates. So we had a call where I kind of talked through the things that we do and what feminism does, and how it's very oriented towards this big picture structural change. It's not just about women's representation, for example. It's a big picture, and it really clicked with them. So I think that's just one example of how just broadening awareness in general about the usefulness of feminism as a lens and gender as a lens. I have seen that once there is an understanding of how this can be useful, people tend to just jump on board, which is really wonderful. I've had a very positive experience with this so far. But yeah, definitely lack of information or awareness, I would say.
And I'm conscious of time, but Laura and Marion, do either of you want to quickly jump in on this question of funding?
I'm happy to move on to another question. I think Marissa has been really comprehensive on this.
Could I just add one thing, if that's okay? Based on working in research partnerships and fundraising, I think we've definitely seen an uptick from certain funding entities, namely governments, in having a gendered lens or gender and inclusion lens in research. And we've seen various ways of approaching that, and various degrees of success, and also various degrees of, seriousness in the way it's done. Some do it really brilliantly, and we've been able to learn a lot from them, and they've been very responsive, and they're willing to learn from us and the way that we do our research and analysis, and they're very willing to learn and adapt. But it's really interesting. Yeah, there's definitely been an increase in interest in doing that, either internally, externally, like around political will. I think there's been numerous variations, but it's great to see that it's been taken more seriously and done properly in ways that create change and make research and analysis that much stronger and work for the communities that we're doing the research on. So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Great. Well, I guess that's a pretty optimistic note to end on. We have gone a couple of minutes over, so I'm very sorry for that. But Laura, Marissa, and Marion, thank you all so much for taking the time to talk to us about the toolkit today, and also thank you for the toolkit, which, if you haven't read it yet, is a very, very good and easy read, and I would definitely recommend it. I think Laura posted a link to it in the chat. You can also find it on the Chatham House website too. But thank you all once again, and if you do have any questions, I'm sure Laura, Marissa, and Marion are happy for you to follow up via email or anything. But have a lovely day, everyone, and thank you again.